Hey everyone, what's going on? I'm making a little video to explain some of the key build concepts and mechanics that go into a Omniscience and Melding of the Flesh Lightning Strike champion. That's been the flavor of the month this patch, and hopefully this will help some of you figure out how the build works and how to craft the individual pieces of gear that go into making this build the monster that it is. So the first question that comes up often is, what do you play until you get crystallized omniscience and melding of the flesh? My recommendation for this would be one of a few duelist builds. You could play Spectral Helix with an Elemental Claw as a champion, which will give you sort of a skill tree that's almost identical to the one you use to play Lightning Strike with. The main alternatives would be playing Bone Shatter Slayer or playing physical two-hand axe Spectral Helix Champion. Obviously, these trees will require a fairly substantial respec once you get all the gear for Omniscience and Melding ready later on, but it depends on personal preference at this point. Those would be my suggestions. So, what is the mandatory gear that you need in order to sort of start playing the version of the build that's so popular? You need Crystallized Omniscience from the Searing Exarch. You need Melding of the Flesh from Eater of Worlds. You need the Belt Perseverance. The best ways to get this belt, it's entirely likely that you'll drop this belt while farming for Omniscience and Melding just naturally. If that doesn't happen, Ancient Orbs are a pretty reliable way of getting it. So you can spec into the Harbinger nodes on the tree and get enough Ancient Orbs to get a Perseverance fairly easily. It's really not that difficult. I would guess the amount of Ancient Orbs required is probably between 30 and 45 on average in my experience. And of course, Gwen and Gambling is always an option. And in particular, if you want to play Lightning Strike, I would suggest that the +1 strike gloves implicit modifier is absolutely mandatory. I tried playing Lightning Strike with all the other gear before I had the gloves ready, and it felt terrible. So I used Spectral Helix until I got the +1 strike gloves, and that feels fine. So what are the key build mechanics and concepts that go into this build? Obviously, we achieve very high armor and evasion since we use Grace and Determination and Defiance Banner, which is the bread and butter of defensive layers these days and very easily slottable into most builds. On this champion, you can easily get over 80,000. Mine currently has about 99,000 of both, and you want to balance the two stats to maximize the damage increase for Perseverance. You want to get Ghost Dance Recovery for the ES pool. You travel along this part of the tree anyway for the Claw nodes, for the Elusive Effect nodes, and Ghost Dance is a great way to recover an ES pool that you can get through the percent life as maximum ES chestcraft mod. So that gives you a nice little recovery mechanic. Life gain on hit with Imperial Claws also feels absolutely fantastic for recovery. The caveat being that you actually need to be attacking for this to be the case. So it's not quite as strong as something like Slayer Overleech or just getting generic Overleech on a build, but still, provided you're able to attack, you can recover through a lot of mechanics. And because of the insane defenses that this build has, you can sit there and face tank a lot of stuff fairly trivially. We also get 90% maximum elemental resistances through Melding of the Flesh. We achieve that with level 23 Purity of Lightning, which by default gives plus 5% maximum lightning resistances. However, when scaled with the aura effect that this build gets, that goes up to plus 10% maximum lightning resistances. So that's important to note that aura effect also scales this effect of Purity of Lightning. We also get +3 maximum lightning resistances on the shield, and we get the helmet implicit as the exquisite searing exarch implicit for +2 max light resistances, and that gives us a total of +15. And Melding of the Flesh applies that to all elemental resistances. One of the key damage contributors is the Nightblade and Elusive Effect mechanic that is absolutely insane and provides an absurd amount of crit and crit multiplier, and it also has substantial defensive benefits as well. So this mechanic might require some further explanation, so let me know in the comments below, or if you're struggling to understand how it works, and I can make a video showcasing it. But effectively, the idea is you use Withering Step to reset the Elusive Effect so that you're always maintaining a fairly high percentage of it. This build easily maintains over 180, I'd say, and that provides a substantial offensive benefit. And another key thing that sometimes goes missed is Pierce, in particular when switching to Lightning Strike. So you definitely need Pierce to make Lightning Strike, and the way it plays in maps feel really good. There's a few ways to get it though, and all of them are fairly trivial, so that's an easy problem to solve. You can either use a Pierce support gem in the main links. That's actually not nearly as bad as it sounds because Pierce support gem has a 20% more damage multiplier, so it's a pretty usable support gem. You can get piercing shots on the skill tree, which gives you +3 pierce when you account for the traveling nodes as well. Or you can use the helmet lab enchant for lightning strike projectiles piercing enemies. All of these are very workable options, and all of them are reasonably well matched. So you choose the one that fits your build best. A common question is why Purity of Lightning is used. And the reason for that is that the helmet implicit for +2% maximum lightning resistance has substantially less opportunity cost than the other Eldritch Influence item slot implicits. So you can get +2 maximum resistances on the other slots as well. You can get +2 cold on gloves, but that's an Exarch implicit, and the other Exarch implicit that you want on gloves is +1 or +2 strikes, which is effectively a mandatory implicit for the build. So that's not an option really. You can get fire on boots, but boots implicit modifiers and the Exarch part in particular have fantastic options. You can get brittle, scorched, and sapped ground depending on whether you want an offensive or defensive effect. You can get action speed, which is obviously insane, or you can get onslaught effect, which is really good because you have permanent onslaught through perseverance. And on the chest, you really want aura effect because aura effect is a substantial offensive and defensive benefit for this build, as it scales the evasion and armor numbers, and it scales the divine blessing aura that you use as well for flat damage. So it's possible to get this max res somewhere else as well, but just the lightning version comes with a substantially smaller opportunity cost. Also, obviously, Purity solves your melding drawback for the lightning resistance, so Melding of the Flesh gives -70 to 80% to all resistances. So Purity with the aura effect effectively eliminates that drawback, and that means, of course, that you need 2 high tier fire and cold resistance rolls somewhere else on the gear. Other purities can be used, so you can use fire or cold especially if you commit an extra suffix on the shield. So in this particular version, we have +3 max lightning resistance from the shield. You can also get up to +2 maximum all resistances as a separate suffix. So that can kind of ease a lot of the pressure on the implicits of the gear. So that's a pretty workable option that a lot of people resort to as well. So feel free to use that one if you prefer it. It's just that the lightning one is arguably the most optimized one. So before we go into gear crafting, I'll just show up a skill tree of the character and the gem setup that I'm using. So we start as champion. We of course spec into the fortify node and unstoppable hero because that's why we're champion pretty much. And inspirational has an incredible amount of aura effect, which is very good, and it also allows you to get the banner for no reservation. And first to strike, last of all gives you adrenaline, which is actually quite easy to maintain all the time if you want to, because you have the divine blessing aura that you use with life tap. So if I press my divine blessing anger twice, you can see that the adrenaline buff comes up, so that's quite easy to maintain. And it also is a defensive layer in some instances if you want to use it as that. So you travel down, you get some of the obvious nodes here for attack speed, life. Fury Bolts is typically preferable to getting Defiance, but in my case, Defiance gives me a 5% increased dexterity because I'm using the Brutal Restraint Jewel here, which is why I've spec'd into it instead of Fury Bolts, but typically you get Fury Bolts here. Get some life. This is a really good node. Cloth and Chain gives you evasion rating and armor, which translates damage in this build and helps bring up the elemental resistances through Omniscience and to counteract the Melding of the Flesh drawback. Get the little leech node. Onslaught effect is excellent because we have perseverance and permanent onslaught. The marks cluster here is really good, and it also provides you a way through the mark mastery to get frenzy charge generation, particularly for single target fights. This is fantastic, and it's a huge damage bonus. And culling strike against the marked enemy is an excellent, effectively a 10% increase in your damage. Collect the life nodes here, nothing special there. This cluster is only used once you have Omniscience, obviously, because it's a substantial stat boost. The suppress cluster, ideally you want to use just these two nodes, and in order to do that, you want T1 suppression, T1 and T2 suppression on your chest and shield. So you can get away with having T2 suppression on one of these slots, and you want T1 suppression on your boots. And with these three suppression rolls, and with these two points here, you get suppression capped. Then you get lethality because it's a fantastic crit multi-node. Some more life, a jewel slot, a bit more crit. There's a few options for this mastery. You can get either non-damaging ailments effect, or you can get reduced extra damage from crit strikes, particularly if you want to do simulacrum or some kind of content in the game where crit defense is important. You can also get the crit multi against unique enemies, and you can get the crit strike chance against enemies on full life. All of these are pretty good options. Depends what you're sort of trying to optimize for. I'm using piercing shots to get my pierce, getting Revenge of the Hunted for some life and evasion. The reservation cluster and aura effect cluster here at charisma is pretty much mandatory. Actually, it is mandatory. Same with the one over up there at influence. So you want to get both of these, and you want to get the aura effect and the mana reservation efficiency masteries there. So we get all the claw nodes, obvious reasons. Get Blood Drinker for life. Dagger mastery. This might seem very weird to people, but the reason for this is pretty much getting the elusive mastery node from this cluster. So this gives you elusive effect and movement speed. The dagger node, the dagger bonuses are completely irrelevant, but the plus 40 crit strike multi is really powerful, especially when you consider the scaling effect of elusive. Similarly here for the claw mastery, you want to get skill supported by Nightblade, have 40% increased effective elusive. Up here we get another jewel node. I've spec'd into this entire cluster because I'm playing solo self-found hardcore and I want to have maximum chaos res. And also this gives me the 12 all res and 7 chaos res mastery option. Then we get Ghost Dance, as discussed earlier. We need some recovery, a little bit of life and ES from Written in Blood, and then we finish off with Influence. And another thing to note, a mandatory annoyance is Sovereignty, both for the reservation efficiency and for the non-cursora effect on your skills. And for the skill gem setup, I have Mark on Hit with Assassin's Mark. That gives you power charge generation against single targets in particular, where it's most important. Really, this build has an abundance of damage and clear speed, so really you want to sort of prop up the single target as much as possible, which is also absolutely absurd, but the more the merrier, right? You get Withering Step in order to just be fast, but most importantly to reset the elusive effect. My aura is Divine Blessing, increased duration, life tap, and anger. You can use Wrath as well. The important thing here to keep in mind when balancing the flat elemental damage buffs that you get is to make sure that you can still maintain the Trinity support gem. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining your resonances at 50 the entire time. So if you have too much flat lightning damage here and you're using Wrath instead of Anger, you might end up in a situation where your lightning damage is the highest damage roll in most cases, and that might make it difficult for you to maintain resonance. So I would suggest swap between Anger and Wrath depending on what the flat damage bonuses in the rest of your gear are. Anger is the most widely used one because most people use Lightning and Cold Claws, and that gives you a sort of substantial flat fire roll here as well, and that makes it very trivial to maintain Trinity. But generally speaking, maintaining Trinity is not that difficult, so you can you can do it pretty easily. It's not a very difficult challenge to overcome. For the main damage links, we have obviously Lightning Strike with Vol. Lightning Strike, the Vol version of the skill is a very good damage multiplier for a single target, and occasionally for certain types of content. Like if you're doing rituals, if you're doing breaches with Flash Breach, stuff like that, you can just drop a Vol Lightning Strike somewhere and have it clear a separate screen somewhere on the side while you're running around. I currently have Awakened Multi-Strike, but typically I would be using I would be using increased critical strikes. So those are the standard links that you'd use. So you'll have Lightning Strike, increased crit strikes, just to make your crit chance pretty high and pretty much capped most of the time. Nightblade Sport, as we've discussed earlier, that's mandatory. One of the flat added elemental damage gems, you can use added cold or added lightning, especially if you have an awakened version of either. But again, be careful to make sure that you can maintain your Trinity Resonance up. Both of them are usable options though. Then you have elemental damage with attacks. I have the awakened version, so I'm using that. And you have Trinity. Those are your default links. Now, before that, if you want to play Spectral Helix, or if you just want to switch to Spectral Helix for any bosses or anything like that, I would drop increased crit and Lightning Strike and get Inspiration instead, because the mana cost of Spectral Helix is really high. So while you can get away without Inspiration for Val Lightning Strike with the two Elrion crafts, it's really difficult to do the same for Spectral Helix. So I would recommend using Inspiration in that particular case. Let's see, other skill notes. Defiance Banner, Determination, Grace, and Purity of Lightning are all in my gloves because I have +2 AoE gems there. I'll go over this shortly. So those are effectively the sources of reservation. I have Molten Shell with either increased duration if you want to cast it manually, or with cast when damage taken if you want it automated. Ancestral Protector Totem for the attack speed, and Tempest Shield as my sort of last reservation option. You can use several different skills here for reservation instead. You could use Aspect of the Crab somewhere, I would suggest, especially if you're playing hardcore, because that gives you a nice physical damage reduction source. You could use another aspect, probably Cat or Spider, I would guess, if you really wanted to. Tempest Shield is just a great defensive option to give you shock immunity, freeing up one of the Pantheon slots, and also some spell block, because why not, frankly. And finally, for the movement skills, I have Whirling Blades. You can also use Shield Charge. It's a matter of personal preference mostly. Flame Dash is pretty much mandatory as a sort of cliff clearing skill and gap clearing skill, because Withering Step consumes a charge, so you can't really use Frostblink, even though Frostblink is a fantastic skill. So you want to have a movement skill with multiple charges, and that's where Flame Dash comes in. And usually this last gem slot can be freed up, so you can use Shield Charge with faster attacks or something similar here. I'm using Precision because I have a Watcher's Eye that requires me to use Precision to get the full benefit out of it. So there's a bit of flexibility in the gems here, and hopefully that helps. And now we can go back to the gear crafting and how to make all of the pieces of gear from scratch if you really wanted to, because the character I just showed you is in solo self-found, so this is entirely possible. And I'll run you through how to craft all the pieces. So for the claw, you want to prepare some claws for use with recombiners. Oh, an important thing to note, recombiners are ridiculous, and you can use them to craft absurd pieces of gear very easily. And I'll show you how, because most of the pieces of gear here are using recombiners. So for the claw, the easiest way to craft a pretty usable claw, which effectively what you need for that is 2 high flat damage rolls, and ideally T1 attack speed. And if you have a fourth useful modifier, that's great. If not, you can multi-mod, and that's a perfectly usable claw. So you want to prepare some claws for recombination with essences. So the essences you want to be using are Zeal, at least Shrieking for the attack speed, Wrath and Hatred for the flat lightning and flat cold damage. You want to use deafening versions of those for sure, and you can also use Essence of Loathing for the crit strike chance. I would suggest recombining claws with at least 2 desired good affixes, so you you might want to recombine claws with let's say high flat roll, high flight lightning damage roll and attack speed against the claw with high cold damage roll and crit strike chance, and eventually you will get something very much usable pretty quickly. As to what else to craft, hits cannot be evaded as a prefix craft makes the rest of your gearing a lot easier. You might be tempted to get a third flat elemental damage roll as a prefix, but that means that you then have to invest in accuracy rating suffixes in your gear, or run a max level precision as part of your gem links, or and probably spec into some accuracy rating on your tree, which makes it comes with a substantial opportunity cost. So hits cannot be evaded is a good option to make your life easier everywhere else pretty much. So an important caveat here, as you can see, my claw has flat fire damage. This is perfectly usable as long as you make sure you're maintaining your Trinity resonances, and you'll see that most people use cold and lightning damage on the claw and use anger as an aura to get high flat fire damage, and that makes resonance maintenance fairly trivial. In my case, when I'm mapping, there are instances when I notice one of the resonances starting to fall off, but I'm always managing to maintain them above 25, so generally not a problem. And especially when I have a single target that I can focus on attacking, I never drop below 50 resonance. So for me, it's fine, but bear that in mind. So for the helmet, ideally you want, this is the place where I've gotten one of my high fire resist rolls and 2 high stat rolls. So you can use essences for stats and for fire resist to effectively fill out the suffixes. Again, you can use recombiners to help. So for instance, you can get a helm with 50 strength and 40 fire res and recombine it against the helmet with 50 int and 40 fire res. And effectively, you just want to make sure that you have the suffixes ready. Once the suffixes are ready, you can just slam 70 lifecraft on it and call it a day. That will be a perfectly usable helmet for a very long time. If you don't have an open suffix, you can harvest reforge to keep the suffixes to most likely open a prefix to craft life. Or if you already have a good life roll, like in my case, you can either craft the hybrid defenses life or the Corel mod, which is physical damage taken as fire, which in our case is a really good way to mitigate phys damage because we have 90 fire res. For the implicits, this is where the difficult part of the crafting comes in. You want to use Grand Eldritch Embers to get a +1 maximum lightning resist as an Exarch implicit, and then you want to use Orbs of Conflict to try to elevate that against a Grand or Exceptional Eater implicit. So when you're starting from a Grand implicit and you want to end up at an Exquisite, you use at least 2 Orbs of Conflict if you're lucky. Realistically, you'll probably use more than that. But once you have the +2 max light res Exarch implicit, then you can just reroll the Eater implicit with Eldritch Ecor currency for mana reservation efficiency. The lowest tier is also fine. I just have a slightly higher tier because I got lucky. For the gloves, this is sort of the higher tier end. You can use regular resistance suffixes here and just use recombiners to craft yourself a usable pair of gloves. But in the end game, you want to go for incursion gloves if at all possible. So you basically want to get the incursion fire and cold hybrid suffix modifiers, which give you both a very high tier fire and cold resistance, and they give you an offensive benefit of increased damage with hits against chilled enemies and flat fire damage added against burning enemies. So you can use in order to get these, we come back to our good old friend the recombiner, and you just get enough pairs of those so that you can recombine a pair that has both suffixes in place. You can get that by speccing into the incursion nodes on the Atlas tree. There's an incursion node over here that gives you incursion architects in your maps have 60% chance to drop an additional rare incursion item. So you can get incursion items from just your alpha missions, and that makes it actually pretty easy to get enough gloves to recombine a pair like these. So once you have the 2 incursion suffixes in place, if you have a third suffix empty, you can do what I did and craft suffixes cannot be changed and use a Harvest Chaos Reforge that basically augments a Chaos Res mod in your suffixes. And I rolled 30 Chaos Res because I'm lucky. And once you have all the 3 suffixes in place, you can log the suffixes and use a Veiled Chaos Orb to get the +2 AoE prefix. This is really important because you want to get level 23 Purity, and you do that by getting +2 level to level of socketed AoE gems, and you get a level 21 Purity of Lightning. So in order to maximize the chance of unveiling this mod, you craft the physical damage conversion to elemental damage before unveiling. I think that's a Varici mod. And once you unveil, you hope for this. I think there's about a 1 in 6 chance, if I remember correctly, to get the +2 AoE gems. So you might have to repeat this process a few times. It is expensive because it's at least two exalts per try, but it is what it is. And finally, to finish the gloves, you just add Crafted Life, and if you have a spare suffix, you can Leo Slam or do something similar. For the implicits, as I said before, +1 strike is absolutely mandatory for Lightning Strike to feel good, in my opinion. You can get +2 strike if you really want with Orbs of Conflict, but I think it's just optional quality of life. +1 strike feels absolutely fine for me, and I've done 99% of the content in the game, and I'm about to delete this character to Uber fights, so that's where it will end probably. And for the Ether implicit, you can either get an additional Pierce, which is just useful, or you can get an elemental exposure, preferably to the element that you're doing the most damage from. On the chest piece, I would recommend using a Strength Dex or Armor Evasion base to get suppression and physical damage reduction. Physical damage reduction is a really, really powerful mod because it helps against physical damage over time and is also good against big physical hits. So things like Shaper Slam, for instance, where having a lot of armor doesn't help that much. Having a lot of armor is really strong against smaller physical hits, but against one giant slam, it's not as powerful a mitigation as just having some flat physical damage reduction. So you want to use, once again, good old friend, the recombiners to prepare the suffixes. You want to use chests with % physical damage reduction, at least tier 2 suppression, as discussed earlier. You can use some chaos resistance, which you can force with essences, or a high stat roll, which you can also force with essences. Once you have the suffixes in place, craft suffixes cannot be changed, and use a Harvest Life Reforge until you get a pretty decent life roll. I'd say don't settle for anything less than 90. And then you can craft % life as extra ES, and that's necessary for the Ghost Dance recovery that we're using. On the implicits, you can get 14% aura effect, which is mandatory. So you want to roll this to get the +10% maximum lightning resistance from purity. Bear in mind that this aura effect is the breakpoint when considering sort of everything else we have on the tree. So when considering the charisma cluster, when considering the influence cluster, the sovereignty anoint, and inspirational, and pretty much every single piece of aura effect we already have on the champion. So this is the way to get this final last % of lightning resistance to get us to the 90% all res. And for the other implicit, I get Grace Effect because that helps me balance evasion and armor. If I go to my character screen, you can see that with Flasks up, I have about 99,000 evasion and armor. So that's pretty well balanced, and that will maximize the perseverance benefit that I get. My chest also has Incursion Life prefix because I'm lucky. On the shield, so again, here I'd recommend using a dex base because it just makes it easier to roll suppression and to make basically shield bases for recombination. Yeah, that's right, we're back to recombiners. So as I said before, at least tier 2 suppression, but bear in mind you want tier 1 and tier 2 across the chest and shield, so be careful what you're doing there, because otherwise you might have to spend some extra points on your tree to max out your suppression. You want +3 maximum resistances. Some people don't know that you can harvest swap these, so if you get +3 max fire, that's fine. You can just use the harvest resist swap from fire to lightning to get +3 max lightning. And you have some other options for the third suffix. You can get a high stat roll that you can force with essences, like I have 55 dex. You can get percent physical damage reduction if you're using a strength dex shield. That's also a fantastic option. And as discussed previously, if you want to open up options to use other purities or just free up some pressure from your other implicits, you can get plus percent maximum all resistances as well. Um, once you have the suffixes recombined in place, ideally you want to have two open prefixes. If you don't, you can either clear the prefixes by crafting suffixes cannot be changed in scouring, or you can use harvest, reforge, keep suffixes, because that very often just adds a single prefix. Once that's in place, craft life and slam a hunter exalt when or if you get one to get guaranteed percent life, ideally T1, but sometimes sometimes RNG is RNG. For the boots, again, I would suggest getting a dex base because it's much easier to roll suppression on them. We're back to recombiners, so we want to recombine pairs of boots with high stat rolls that you can force with essences. Chaos res if you need it, which you can also force with essences, and T1 suppression. Here, T1 suppression is, I would say, mandatory unless you get T1 suppression on both chest and shield. Um, so once you have the suffixes in place, you might be getting tired of this now, but the process is the same. Suffixes cannot be changed, and veiled chaos. Here we want to craft life because we actually don't want to unveil life because the life rolls that we unveil are not that good. And you want to unveil a movement speed prefix. The best one to unveil is movement speed and cannot be chilled because just chill immunity is it's surprisingly useful. The other movement speed suffixes prefixes are also fine. You can get pretty decent chill mitigation through dual implicits and the Brine King Pantheon. So it's not the end of the world if you get one of the other ones. And then you can just craft life to finish. In my case, I had a T1 life roll from the recombiner, so I just crafted the movement speed instead. And for the implicits here, there's a lot of good options, so it's kind of a matter of personal preference. I have brittle ground for a nice crit effect, particularly in boss fights, and cooldown recovery for travel skills. This is really good because it also affects Withering Step, because it also has the travel tag. And the boots are also a good place to get a lab enchant, which can give you some nice added flat damage. In my case, this is for single target only, since it's if you haven't killed recently. But bear that in mind. These can be quite powerful. For the rings, I would recommend using Vermilion or Amethyst rings in order to help you cap Chaos Res or just get as much life as possible, depending on if you have enough Chaos Res from everywhere else. So Vermilions are a bit too rare usually to use very liberally recombiners to force the suffixes, but you can just use stat essences and harvest Chaos Reforge, and sooner or later you will land on something like this, which is quite usable. So you want at least like tier 2 stats and a decent Chaos Res roll suffixes. Once you have the suffixes in place, guess what? Suffixes cannot be changed in Veiled Chaos. You want to craft mana on the prefixes before you unveil, because that will block the mana unveils, which are the most common one other than the life one. And in the vast majority of cases, actually it might be guaranteed, you will be able to unveil life and mana regen, which is a 60 life roll, which scales up to 72 with Catalyst, so that's a pretty decent place to stop. And you can then craft the Aerion mods to reduce the mana cost. So typically this method will leave you another open prefix, like in my case, in which case you can Leo Slam with Leo in Research or Exalt Slam and hope for something useful. On this particular ring, I got flat cold damage to attacks, which is great. And that was a good place to end. And pretty much you use the same ring on the other slot. In my case, I have percent all resist as the other suffix because that helps me be overcapped for curses. So there is some flexibility in the suffixes. You don't have to have everything in this way, and you can trade a lot of these off in other places. Similarly, actually, with the gloves and helm, you could get +2 on helm instead of gloves. That's also a perfectly viable option. So don't feel forced to get the exact mods in the exact slots. there is some flexibility in what you get where. And finally, for the jewels, obviously we use Melding of the Flesh. Timeless jewels are really powerful in this build, and you should use the jewel socket below the duelist start. I'll show you my brutal restraint. So I'm getting 8% aura effect from Golem's Blood. I'm getting 8% aura effect from Bravery. I'm getting 5% dexterity from which converts to Omniscience from Master of the Arena, and 5% dexterity from Defiance, which is why I've spec'd Defiance instead of Fury Bolts. If I get the Helmet Pierce enchant, I will unspec these and also get Fury Bolts because that gives me some effective ailments. So that's a pretty good one. You can also use a Lethal Pride. So I was actually using Lethal Pride before that, and the things you want in the if you're using Lethal Pride are chance to deal double damage, percent attributes, flat attributes, percent max life, stuff like that. And they're a similar sort of mod pool for Brutal Restraint that you want to prioritize. For the rare jewels, you want attack speed, percent life, and crit multiplier as much as possible of all of these. And another option that you can use is Mantra of Flames, which adds a decent amount of flat fire damage since you have quite a lot of buffs on the entire time. And that pretty much covers it. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope some of you found this useful. Feel free to shoot me any questions. I know that some of this may be a little hard to decipher. So if you're not sure or if you didn't understand anything about this explanation, feel free to shoot me a message in game or just leave a comment, and I'll be happy to help. And yeah, take care of yourselves.